which means that's not the problem we're having. It would be great if we could get to all of them, but I don't know if we're actually going to manage it. Unfortunately, this interest is not actually motivating girls to get from their hobby interest in these topics into the workplace. In the last 25 years, job growth for women in these fields has been basically stagnant. And in some subfields like computer science, they're actually losing women. So there's a breakdown. We need to figure out how this is happening and stop trying to treat the wrong problem. My research explores the degree to which STEM textbooks present a barrier to women's involvement in STEM. Over the last year, I've looked at the numbered exercise sections in textbooks. This is the section that comes at the end of the lesson. That's the homework pages. My sample includes 10 textbooks that are currently in use at my own college. I tracked individuals described in these homework problems, looking at how they were named and described, their gender, occupation, and relationship roles, skill and success at various tasks, what kind of interactions they participated in, and what I call morbidity, mortality, and violence, or MMV. This is conditions of suffering, any kind of illness, injury, death, of course, and any kind of violence. My hypothesis is that the presentation of women and girls in STEM textbooks constitutes a major trigger condition for stereotype threat in students who identify as women and girls. Unpacking that sentence would take at least an hour, so I won't go into the mechanics of stereotype threat triggers. It's very interesting, you should Google it, but today I'm going to contextualize my findings in a little bit of a different way. I'm going to talk about girls' self-reported fears about what it means to be a woman in a STEM field. These fears are borrowed from a 2012 survey of middle and high school girls conducted by the Girl Scout Research Institute. So these represent attitudes that girls have already by the time they arrive at college. Since this space does not accommodate PowerPoint, or did not when I wrote this, may or may not. Anyway, I don't accommodate PowerPoint. I do have a handout with just a couple of key findings. I know it's early, so I'm not going to load you guys down with too many statistics. Yes. I worked so hard to make sure that I had a very gender neutral color scheme that was still pretty easy to read. I didn't want to do blue and pink while talking about how sexism is bad. So, I've just got a couple of relevant figures here. One of the most common fears reported in the Girl Scout study was concern about being isolated from other girls. Teen girls were very concerned about the idea of being the only woman in a class or a workplace environment. Now, in the undergraduate level, this isn't actually a very valid concern. There are lots of women in undergraduate STEM classrooms. The textbooks don't show us that. Gender distribution, as you can see in the top left segment here, is fairly close to equal across all problems. But once the individuals are identified in a STEM role, that completely breaks down. People who are identified as being in a STEM role, including students, were more than twice as likely to be men than women. So out of every person identified in a STEM role, less than 20% were explicitly feminine. Socialization was also unequal between the genders, which is that top right segment. Overall, men and women were about as likely to be portrayed as having some sort of interaction with another person. And men were about as likely to interact with women as with other men. Slightly more with men, but there were more men in the sample, so that makes a certain amount of sense. Women were twice as likely to interact with men as with other women. I believe it was less than 10% of women, 7% of women interact with other women. Half of those interactions, 50% on the nose, were with family members. So women were highly isolated from anyone they weren't actually related to. Across 10 books, there are 15 instances of women interacting with a non-relative woman. against STEM women specifically, there's no example of a woman who interacts with another woman, including relatives. None of the STEM women interacted with other women in any book.
Can I ask one thing?
For sure.
Just to make sure that everyone knows what STEM is, can you?
Oh yes, that's science, technology, engineering, and math. So this does exclude medical science, but it includes most other
Physics, chemistry, engineering,
biology. Often it excludes behavioral science as well, because Americans don't realize that behavioral science is science. Super weird. In other countries, there's not this confusion. 50% of Americans don't think behavioral science counts as science. Yeah, I know.
Well, that's because we don't do things with labs and Bunsen burners.
Right, which of course,
Psychology definitely works in labs.
and Bunsen burners sometimes.
No, that's.
Not unless you're trying to.
Well, I mean,
that
not since the
depends
1950s.
on what kind of stress test you're doing.
Ethics are important. Anyway. In addition to the fear of social isolation, a lot of the fears that the girls expressed had to do with overt discrimination. Women worried about being treated like an outsider because of their gender. They worried about not receiving appropriate credit for contributions. And they worried about having to work harder than their male colleagues in order to be taken seriously. This is a legitimate concern. Gender discrimination is a serious issue in STEM classrooms and workplaces, and that can't be stressed enough. That has to get fixed. But the book makes it look worse than it is. There's more discrimination and exclusion of women in the books than in the real world. Underrepresentation of women in the books was actually considerably more dramatic than underrepresentation of women in the real STEM field. And of course, this has been stagnant for the last 25 years, so this isn't like we've outstripped them in the last 5 years, everything's good for us now, but the books haven't caught up. This has been the same for the last 25 years, and the books haven't caught up yet. In the books, 12.5% of people represented in a STEM profession were women. 12.5%. In the very worst subfield for gender parity of STEM, which is engineering, 13% of the field is women. That's the worst. When you get into biology, men and women are equally represented. So the books are worse than the most unequal real-world conditions. They actually make STEM jobs look less accessible to women than they really are. Fears about due credit are also reinforced with the shocking rarity with which real-world STEM professionals are discussed in the texts. The books mention a total of 47 individuals who are real people in STEM professions. Darwin is a great example. So these are people from the past and present who've contributed in various ways, either to the concepts being taught or just making connections. The first chapter of a chemistry textbook says, oh, this is a woman who contributed in the following ways just in the last 20 years. So some of these are more recent, some of them aren't. There's 47 total people. 16 of them were mentioned more than once, and 3 were mentioned more than 5 times. Of the 47 individuals, 5 were women. That's 5 women in 10 textbooks. On average, a 500 to 1,000 page textbook has half of a woman. Only one of these women, Marie Curie, was mentioned twice. All of the other women were mentioned only once. In one of the mentions of Marie Curie, the record-breaking Nobel laureate, the only person ever to win Nobel Prizes in more than one category, is referred to by her first name only. Yes. If Marie Curie doesn't get treated with respect, what am I supposed to do? I expect these girls to wonder. Now, the books aren't particularly stingy with their praise. They talk about people in the STEM field. They also talk about people outside the STEM field. So to really contextualize this finding, I've compiled a list of real figures and literary figures who show up in the textbooks more often than Marie Curie. Marie Curie was mentioned twice. Lance Armstrong is mentioned 7 times. Phil Mickelson is mentioned 6 times. If you haven't heard of him, he was I think a tennis pro in the 50s. Tarzan was also mentioned more often than Dr. Curie. On par with Dr. Curie are Shaquille O'Neal, Superman, and Jane. Now, of course, from Tarzan. When there were women in STEM roles in the textbooks, they were consistently portrayed as being less competent than their male colleagues. Women were more often portrayed in low-skilled tasks and unskilled tasks. They were 2/3 as likely to have a clear success and twice as likely to have an overt failure, including at unskilled tasks. Some women in STEM professions failed at unskilled tasks, and I was very generous about what counted as a skill. Male colleagues never did this. There were no unskilled failures among STEM men. One of these failures is a physics professor who fails at the exceedingly low-skill task of standing without falling down. A physics teacher performing an outdoor demonstration suddenly falls from rest off a high cliff and simultaneously shouts, "Help!" When she's fallen for 3 seconds, she hears the echo of her shout from the valley floor below. The speed of sound is given. How tall is the cliff? And if air resistance is neglected, how fast will she be moving just before she hits the ground?
Because that's not sexist.
This is, of course, also an excellent example of a morbidity, mortality, and violence condition, which leads to my final point. About 1/3 of the girls in the Girl Scout study expressed concerns that entering STEM fields would expose them to gendered crime. These are girls who are 16, 12, and in middle and high school, they equate entering a STEM job with sacrificing their personal safety. This seems like an outlandish thing to equate, but it is supported by the textbooks. Non-STEM men and women were about equally likely to experience mortality, morbidity, mortality, and violence. STEM men were much safer than STEM women. In fact, men in STEM roles faced only about 1/4 of their normal rate of morbidity, mortality, and violence. STEM women were twice as likely to be in MMV conditions. So, gender-ambiguous individuals were considerably more likely to be subject to MMV in non-STEM roles because you often had people of no gender identified only as patient. You know, if the patient has a disease, that's going to show up. There's a lot of health applications in these books. But though there were gender-ambiguous STEM-identified people, none of them were MMV conditions. So this means that being identified in a STEM role makes everyone safer except women, and it made women considerably more vulnerable to harm. There's also the gratuitously macabre quality to the way that these conditions are described for women only. This is not present in the way that morbidity, mortality, and death in men is described. There's only one man who dies in any of the problems, and it's Dr. Evil from Austin Powers. His helicopter explodes. It's not even really explicit that he dies, but his helicopter explodes. No STEM professional men die. 2 STEM professional women die. There is the unfortunate physics professor from the cliff problem, and there's another problem that asks students to describe the forces at work tearing a woman astronaut's body apart as she enters a black hole. Yes. This is specifically calculating the difference in pressure from one ear to another, so it's extremely clear that this is not going to end well for the astronaut. And then there's this one. A man marries a great Wagnerian soprano, but alas, he discovers that he cannot stand Wagnerian opera. In order to save his eardrums, the unhappy man decides he must silence his wife for good. His plan is to tie her to the front of his car and send car and soprano speeding toward a brick wall. The soprano is quite shrewd, however, having studied physics in her student days at the music conservatory. She realizes that the wall has a resonant frequency of 600 hertz, which means that if a continuous sound wave of this frequency hits the wall, it will fall down, and she will be saved to sing more Isoldes. The car is heading toward the wall at a high speed of 30 meters per second. At what frequency must the soprano sing so that the wall will crumble? This question presents a man murdering his wife because he doesn't like her job as amusing hijinks. The tone of the question seems to imply that crumbling the wall solves your problem. I tend to think of this a little bit differently. I'm sure I'm not the only person who thinks that a woman tied to a car moving 30 meters per second is not okay yet. There's also, of course, no indication that anything happens to the man in response to his attempted murder. And didn't he think of divorce or asking his wife to rent a performance space? Rehearsal hall? There are options here. Of course, the woman in this question isn't real, but the women and men reading it are. It's reasonable to think that teens who arrive at college already fearing for their safety and expecting discrimination would be a bit turned off by cavalier jokes about women gruesomely dying. We might even wonder how this brand of humor is affecting the men in these departments. The books aren't just teaching skills, they're introducing the culture of STEM fields. They tell men and women how they can expect to be treated in this environment, and the message that they're sending is far from equal. Going forward, it will be important to verify experimentally whether the inclusion of devaluing and threatening problems does affect students' attitudes and engagement. It'll be especially important to see how this falls across different demographics, whether this encourages devaluing of women's participation in a real environment, and of course whether it encourages women to stop being interested in STEM. It's also very important to consider this from an intersectional perspective. Many of the fears reported in the Girl Scout study were most prevalent among Hispanic and African American girls. Women of color are the most underrepresented demographic in STEM jobs, and it's particularly vital to look at how these patterns of fear reinforcement affect them. Thank you.
We should probably both present as
And
questions.
then, that's actually great because it kind of feeds right into mine. Because I'm going to talk about domestic violence in my PowerPoint here, so picture it on the wall.
Pretend that there's a picture.
Pretend that it's on the wall.
You can do this. You can say, okay, so here's the first
Here's
slide.
I know, I should have done that. That would have been great.
The first time I ever presented at CSA, I brought 12 copies of my PowerPoint, and I brought transparencies and the PowerPoint, and I had to hand out the handouts because there was no presenting anything.
That's
That was
that's
there,
smart
so.
though. All right, I'm going to start with just a couple of facts about domestic violence, and I would like to tell you, I'm a student at CSUN, an undergraduate, but I also am a domestic violence court advocate. So I do restraining orders for women, and then I also accompany them to court as their advocate when they get the restraining orders. 24 people per minute experience intimate partner violence, which is now what they call it, IPV. And this one was really interesting to me when I was doing my research. 18,700 of the annual workplace violence episodes are related to current or former intimate partner violence relationships. So I didn't actually even know that there were over 18,700 workplace violence incidents every year. So obviously there must be more than them if 18,700 of them involve domestic violence or intimate partner relationships. Also, 1 in 4 women in the U.S. will report intimate partner violence in their lifetime. 30% of all women and 5%, 5.3% of men are killed by intimate partners. in the US. And that's like a national, across, you know, a long-range statistic. 33%, there's a 33% chance that a high school girl will now experience dating violence of some kind. So that's a new thing that they're starting to research, is dating violence. And so that's about, you know, 1 in 3. That's very startling. And then there's a gender and also, a racial component to this. And according to the American Bar Association, the #1 cause of death for African American women between the ages of 15 and 34 is at the hands of an intimate partner. That is the #1 cause of death. So these are some significant statistics. So my research involved, I'm sure that you've all heard about the release on September 8th of the Ray Rice videotape, kind of the tape heard around the world. And what interested me about it is that working in the field, it wasn't until the tape was released that even I was aware of it, and finding out that it happened on February 15th and that he had received a 2-game suspension in July, and that it was only a 2-game suspension, and that it still hadn't like resonated, you know, being in the field and everything. It was like it was out in the stratosphere and you kind of knew about it, and it wasn't until that tape came out I thought, what's going on? Because then it was everywhere. So I wanted to do a content analysis of the media coverage and find out what was going on and what happened because of it. Because once the tape came out, it changed everything. After the tape came out that same day, he was not only, instead of the 2-game suspension, he was not only fired by the Ravens, but he was indefinitely suspended from the NFL in 1 day. So just because of the media coverage. So what I did was I used Joel Best's basic history model of social problems, which I'm not sure if you're at all familiar with that. And it's a 6-step process. And he said, and his idea is, he's a constructionist theorist, and his idea is that nothing is a social problem in the world until people believe it's a social problem. And there are 6 stages. The first stage is claims making, where somebody comes out and says, hey, this is a problem. With something like domestic violence, it's a valence issue, so it's not one where a claims maker has to convince anybody that it's a problem. So it more starts with step 2, which is media coverage. And he claims that the extent, duration, and narrative of that media coverage shapes how social action takes place after that. Step 3 is the public reaction. How strongly the public is affected by that media coverage impacts what the course that the legislation, the policy is going to take. Step 4 is a policymaker. What happens as a result of that? And then step 5 is the social problems work, and it's all a cycle. It's like once you have that public reaction, once there's policy making, then it's the implementation, then it's the outcomes. Did the stuff work? What changed? And it keeps being a cycle. The media then portrays what the outcomes are if they portray them. And it's an ongoing thing. So I wanted to see particularly the media coverage, the public reaction, and what policies came out of it. So what I did is I picked 3 sources. I wanted a mainstream news source, and I did it online. So I did CNN.com. I wanted a celebrity-based source because I wanted to compare. So you have people, and then I wanted a sports-based because I wanted to see if there was a difference in the types of coverage. So I did Sports Illustrated. And I used Ray Rice as my search parameter just because I wanted it to be really easy and really accessible. I wanted to plug everything between, and the parameters I used was the date of the incident, February 15th, through the end of October. I wanted to see what articles they had and what types of articles those were. And then like I say, I used Joel Best's model. So for CNN, they had 108 stories. 90% of them were starting from September 8th. So only 10% of their stories were from the time the incident happened until the time the tape was released. For People, same thing. It was 87% of them started from the time the tape was released. So that means even though he actually got indicted, he got indicted in March, he made a public apology in July, he got the 2-game suspension, all of that, The media coverage, 90% of it, almost 90%, and 90% for CNN, which is a major news source, occurred after that tape, which is probably why we weren't aware of it, even working in that industry. Now for Sports Illustrated, they had 103 stories. 71% of them happened after the media, so they had almost 30% that occurred during. They did have some coverage as a sports-based throughout the process. They spiked when he got the 2-game suspension, and he made the apology, and it makes sense because that impacted, I guess, fantasy football and trading and things like that. So their coverage and was also a little bit different. The interesting thing about Sports Illustrated is they covered it that one week, and while People and CNN continued the following week, the week that it came out, like CNN had 70 articles, the following week they still had 27, and then they trickled down and People trickled down. Sports Illustrated had 74 articles the week that the tape came out, and then nothing. I even did other searches just to make sure, even though it wasn't my search parameter, because I thought there was something wrong with my computer. I said, why aren't you covering this anymore? And football had started, regular football, and there was no coverage of the incident after that, and I thought that was fascinating. So this was good. I had and it had different colors on my PowerPoint just to show you, but I already explained it so you get the idea. It was really pretty up on the screen. So I did a crosstab analysis of the media coverage because I just wanted to see what type of coverage it was, and I broke it down by this coverage that talked about the system, whether it was NFL or the domestic violence system, but it was more of a macro perspective. And then the headlines that were batter focused, so Ray Rice or a batterer focused, and then victim focused. That talked about either the wife, who was the fiance at the time, Janae, or a victim of domestic violence. So I wanted to look at the headlines and the article to see what it was, and see if there was any difference in the coverage. And there was some difference. Like for instance, Sports Illustrated, and then I also, I broke down those into articles that were, the narrative was critical of the system, was supportive of the system, or was about specific action, like he was suspended, or this happened. So if the article was just a straightforward, this happened. And the same with the batter. Were they critical? Were they supportive? Or was it action? And some of the things that I noted were that for victim support, the sports one had no articles that were supportive of the victim at all. People had the most support for the most articles. 25% of their articles were supportive of the victim. And then CNN came in with 10%. So all of those are low percentages as it is, of all of their articles being supportive of the victim. When it comes to being critical of the victim, Sports Illustrated, which only had 2% of their articles related to the victim at all, and they were critical of the victim. So People, although they had articles that were supporting of the victim, they also had 12% of their articles critical of the victim, that it was the victim's fault. Now, for support of the batter, Sports Illustrated had 16% of their articles that were supportive of the batter, which was fascinating to me, and I'm going to show you some of the headlines in a moment. 65% overall of Sports Illustrated's coverage was just focused on the system, the NFL system. So whether good or bad or otherwise, the majority of their stuff did not focus on the batter or the victim. And then from there, 32% was the batter, and that 2.9% was the victim. For People, theirs was 31% for the system as a whole, 31% for the batter, and they had a little bit more for the victim, 37.5%. And then CNN was 55% for the system, 31.4% for the batter, and 12% for the victim. So in each case, the victim and the victim's voice was poorly represented in the media. So I have some snippets of some of the headlines and a little bit of the story. So for the system-focused critical, examples were like on 99cnn.com, an ex-player of the NFL, and this was a lot of insider, they talk about insider and outsider narrative and how that impacts the social action. So there were a lot of, when they were critical of the system, they were quoting either politicians or they were quoting NFL people. So they always had an insider when they were doing criticism. There was always somebody important. So this was a former NFL player. It was usually when they were critical, it was somebody who wasn't currently. And the headline was, former NFL player, the league fumbled on Ray Rice. So that was the headline in CNN. And then People had Hannah Storm, who's an ESPN reporter, saying, what does the NFL stand for? In that article, she's a very strong, she's very famous in ESPN, but she was talking about what does she explain to her girls about the NFL based on how they were handling it. And both of those came after the tape was released. For supportive of the system and how the system handled the situation, a lot of it had to do with Roger Goodell and whether or not he did the right thing initially with only suspending Ray Rice for 2 weeks. And there were a lot of articles about when they saw the tape, did they see the tape? So some of the articles had to do with that. So, like for instance on 9/9, there was one about Roger Goodell saying, you know, we didn't see any videotape, and that went back and forth, and people said you did see the videotape. And then there was an article on CNN where it just basically said in defense of Roger Goodell. And so here's his victim, here's the stuff, this is the day, the week after the tape came out, and there was an article where they were basically saying what a great guy he was, and every step he made along the process was the right thing. You know, but you never saw anything like that about the victim and what she went through, so that was really interesting. Now for action things that happened, a couple of them that were interesting were a report on domestic violence called Spiking. That was 2 days after the video came out. It said in the wake of the Ray Rice video that the national hotline, the domestic violence called spiked. So those kinds of reports did happen, but that was the only one that specifically talked about the domestic violence system as opposed to the NFL system. That was the only article that actually talked about a system other than the NFL. And another one were women's senators demand zero tolerance on NFL with domestic violence. So that was on 9/12. So that was something that was interesting. That was an action, and this is in the Joel Best model. This is the public reaction starting to move into the policy, starting to move into step 4, because we're starting to see insiders like women senators coming together and starting to make that step. So he talks about how the public's outraged, and this is 2 days after the tape comes out, and they've already organized. But again, the incident happened in February. The 2-game suspension happened in July. 2 days after the tape is released, the women senators get together and demand zero tolerance. Why not zero tolerance, you know, back in February or back in July? So better focused, critical. We have an ex-Raven coming out, you know, an article where he says, I don't have respect for a man who puts his hands on a woman. That came out the day after the tape for Sports Illustrated. And then we've got another one with a politician. Clinton weighed in on 9/24 on CNN saying, it says, Clinton, I hope Rice never does it again. It was critical of Ray Rice, but when you read the rest of the article, I waffled about whether to put it in the critical of better category or the supportive of better. Because when you read it, he's like, I hope he never does it again, but there was that underlying but, you know, kind of like it's not horrible.
Boys with the boys.
Boy, yeah, it was very much a, you know, so I was like, it's not supportive, but it's not really critical. The articles that focused on being supportive of the batter, this one was very interesting and it shocked me. On 7/29, when they suspended him for 2 games, so this is well before the tape, one of the headlines read, Ravens fans give Ray Rice a standing ovation during practice. So, you know, I mean, it's just blown away. Now, this will significantly change after the tape comes out, but the fact is that the event actually occurred. So this really shows Joel Best's social model in action, too, that a social problem is only a social problem when people believe it's a social problem. Because the thing had actually happened. And people are giving this man a standing ovation who beat his wife.
Which source was that from?
This is from 7/29 on SportsIllustrated.com. Now, the interesting thing for a batter supportive, and I think there were like 7 of these articles. On 9/16, a supportive article was Ray Rice's wife supporting him and slamming the NFL. one of the most horrific things she'd ever gone through, him being suspended. And that was what started a lot of the victim backlash, was people not understanding why she was upset with him leaving. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But that's when people just really got on the victim criticizing bandwagon, is why is she upset that he's being punished. Now for Better Action, it was just about him being indicted, and then when he held a press conference to apologize and say that he was sorry, which was back in May. And again, this was in May, he held a press conference saying that he failed miserably. It was reported on Sports Illustrated. Nobody else picked it up. It wasn't picked up by CNN, wasn't picked up by People magazine, and there was still it made no media waves. So he holds a press conference, nothing. So victim-focused critical. On 7/29, the same time as that standing ovation occurred, Rush Limbaugh, there was an article where he said, regarding the Ray Rice domestic abuse, how bad could it have been? And when you read the article, he goes on to say, she married him, didn't she? Because she was his fiancée at the time. So it must not have been very bad. And I can't believe that article didn't even get backlash. Because after the tape came out, when people said that, there was a backlash of people saying that, people criticizing the victim. But, so that was shocking, and that was again in Sports Illustrated. So they had no problem carrying that. Now this one happened on 9/9, and this one is the epitome of what's happening in domestic violence. They're not coming right out and criticizing the victim. This article says, longer Ray Rice casino video shows spitting and obscenities. And when you read the article, it's not coming out and saying that it was her fault, but the first sentence of the article says, the longer video shows Janae spitting at Ray Rice before he punches her. Spitting at him and calling him obscenities. So it's like there's this underlying thread of, like, had she not spit at him?
But she was asking.
Yeah, that she was asking for, but they're not coming out and saying it, but you're clearly seeing it. So it's this very, yeah, it's very subtle. It's like, why is that a headline? So that's very dangerous, and we see that all the time in domestic violence. Now for the supportive victim focus, I couldn't find any supportive videos or articles for Janae Rice. I couldn't find any out there. What I could find were supportive articles for other victims, because we had a lot of victims start coming forward. We had Miss America revealing that she had been in an abusive relationship, and so there were some articles that were supportive of her, so at least there was that. Nothing for Janae. And then Meredith Vieira revealed on the Today Show that she had been in an abusive relationship. And what was interesting about that is that she explained why she stayed, and she wanted to explain that hashtag why I stayed, because that was what was happening. Janae Rice was getting that pushback for defending Ray Rice, and people were saying, why didn't you just leave? It couldn't have been that bad. Why didn't you just leave? But when Meredith Vieira came out and explained that she had been in this relationship and why she stayed, this hashtag why I stayed started trending. And it started on 9/10, and within a couple hours it had 121,000 women who had posted reasons why they had stayed. And I have some of the examples here, such as, I was pregnant when he hit me because I was raised to think that's what love looked like. I was terrified and I was broken. And those are things that we hear all the time. The average amount of time that a woman goes back when she comes to our shelter, for us, is 7 to 9 times. And that is supported by the literature, that's very common, 7 to 9 times. So it's just, there's a lot of it's financial. There are a lot of reasons that they don't, stay in the shelter, that they go back. But in terms of the Joel Best model, so the media coverage, it spurred people into action, and so the public reaction was on September 9th, so he had been suspended and it hadn't done anything except let his fans give him a standing ovation. But after the video on September 9th, Baltimore restaurants began offering free pizza in exchange for Ray Rice jerseys. A local tavern was offering people a $10 bar tab to exchange their Ray Rice jersey to get rid of it. This is in Baltimore. And then on 9/20, over 7,000 fans lined up at at the stadium to return their Ray Rice jersey for another jersey. So you can really see from the Joel Best model that here in July, you've got these people giving this man who beat his wife a standing ovation. And then on 9/20, you've got these fans standing up and 7,000 of them returning their jersey. You do see that it is actually happening. And policy making, what's happened is the NFL, even though they did announce a new policy prior to the video coming out that they were going to, on the first incident, change it to a 6-game suspension, and on a second incident, they were going to have a lifetime ban. It wasn't enough. Once the video came out, they've now decided that they hired Lisa Friel, who is a former New York Sex Crimes Unit, the head of that, and she and 2 other women are heading up their task force, and they're going to review their entire policy and make a brand new policy about their domestic violence. So that's a piece of legislation and actual action that's coming out of this. And on 10/22, PSAs began running during football games. I don't know if any of you have seen them. It's called the No More campaign, and it's NFL, former and current NFL stars, and they say things like, no more boys will be boys. No more, she looks fine to me. No more, I'll say something next time. And this campaign is now going on, and the PSA announcements are directed by people like Mariska Hargitay and people like that, and Blair Underwood. All these people are stepping up to direct these videos. So those are 2 real things that have come out of this from the media. So, so for future research, what I would like to do is I would like to actually, first of all, I want to see what the procedures are that are implemented, then, which is his step 5, then see what that does in terms of doing surveys to see what public opinion is, how it changes. I would like to do, if there's a way to do it, to see if I can do content analysis back when the Chris Brown Rihanna thing happened. That didn't, in terms of legislation, nothing changed, but it wasn't attached to something like the NFL. So it would be a little harder, but it would be nice to come up with some kind of a comparative study to see what the difference is between the 2. Because there is a Rihanna connection. They were using one of her songs to play during the NFL. That was going to be part of the theme. And they pulled the song. And she got really upset and took to Twitter. And that's a victimization of her. She didn't do anything wrong, but they felt that it wasn't appropriate because she was a victim of battering to have her song playing as part of the NFL. What did she do? You know, that's re-victimizing her. So that would be something to look at. So that's it. That's what I've got.
I know we have at least one other presenter. Is a 4th presenter here? No. Okay. Sean, I guess you're next. You can present from there. You can present wherever you want.
Okay. Good morning, everybody.
And
Sorry,
announce the
sorry.
title of what you're presenting so that we know.
Of course. So, morning, everybody. Apologize for my tardiness, but things happen. So, mine is about mine is talking about Asian privilege. So, what is Asian privilege and how is it seen in modern society compared to Canada? Mine is more about is not so much as like hard research, but more it's a literature review. So it's more of a proposal as to like what I want to do in the future. So more studying about Asian American culture and how it like contributes to society. So one thing that kind of questions is just like what actually is privilege, just to kind of get your mind kind of in the zone, I guess. So from the actual like dictionary, a privilege is just like a right or benefit given to some people and not to others. So also it's morally or socially correct or acceptable. So in that sense, it's just like something that's given to you and you can't give it away, no matter how hard you try or just like how hard you try to just like give it away. So mine was more centered around the idea of going through a question about like going through the sources that I had and also through mass media and how it's representing the community itself of Asian American culture. I didn't want to go into like so much into the Mexican American, or Latin American or any other type of other cultures or races, just because it would kind of throw off my topic a little bit. So I didn't want to compare the two, but some of the statistics was like a pretty astounding as to like what was actually going on when pitted against like other non-white minorities. So it was very interesting, but so I will touch base on it, but not a lot. So try not to like go too much into your questions. But from what my understanding is that from what Fegan was talking about in Racist America, in his book called Racist America, is that some Americans with ancestral roots in Asia or Latin America have been able to alter their racialized status within the white dominant society, but only because whites have come to see them as better in racial, physical, and or cultural terms than African Americans. So what he's basically saying is that in terms of Asian Americans as a culture or as a race, whichever one you prefer to call them, they're more considered to be better than all the other non-whites. So which comes to bring the whole idea about modern minority. And so when I'm talking about modern minority, he's also reiterating the fact that it's a white crafted term accenting achievements of certain Americans of color, often to downplay racism. So it's like, oh, you're better. We deem you better than everybody else, kind of concept, which is very, I mean, to me is very racist. Just to kind of pull me out from like my own, like to pull me out from other minorities. So even when we're included, when I mean we, I mean Asian Americans, when we're included in statistics, sometimes we actually get pulled out from statistics and go white, Asian American, and then non-whites. It does happen. It's just very, sometimes it can be subtle, and sometimes it can be very like, here it is. So one of them was that there was this article that was called Asian American College Students as Modern Minorities, an examination of their overall competence. And so what they were talking about is, the exact quote was, take the stereotype of an Asian American student who excels academically, but possesses limited social skills and ability to meet life's challenges outside the classroom. So what they're saying is, with this privilege comes, with great power comes great responsibility, basically. And so, since they have such a high cultural background in education, they're more susceptible of not having any type of social adaptation at all. So, and this is what their studies were showing. And so, there was also about, let's see, they were also talking about, there's this Asian ceiling, so to speak, as same comparisons to like the glass ceiling, which is like there's a certain point where like you can't make the same amount as a white person in terms of like if you do the same exact job. And that's across for women, but it also not only does it happen between gender, but it also happens between races. So, and it also happens to Asian Americans as much as we would want to be. It just doesn't happen. There was this in 2009, since the California passed Proposition 209, which forbade the whole idea about affirmative action. And so with the abolition, or sorry, with the teardown of, or with the passing of 209 and getting rid of and forbidding affirmative action, the Asians actually soared to 40% on the population at public universities. So from whatever it was before, it's now at 40% to the public universities, even though they make up just 13% of the state residencies. So that means, when you think about that, in terms of like California, like how big we are, like 13% of the population is Asian American, but 40% are actually like seceding and going to public universities. I mean, that's a pretty good amount. That's a lot. But there's a reason behind that, though. This is public universities, though. So they're willing to sacrifice, the elites are actually willing to sacrifice that. But in terms of Ivy League schools, they have actually like taken notice of it and take it very seriously. And so some of them have operated secretly for the quotas for decades to maintain this idea of called WASP, which is a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant credential. So basically, and this is reported by Finley and Kohler in their report. And what they were saying is that the elites are basically kind of like cutting out certain races from their schools just to meet their quotas of meeting the WASP criteria. So, sounds conspiracy theorist, but there are facts that back that up. It's just I don't have them offhand right now. I would have more, but I didn't bring them. There is also the fact of, like, when I was talking about how it's presented in modern society, when you think of Asians, you always